I am sure by now that most people have heard the gruesome news of the brutal murder and decapitation of two Scandinavian girls in Morocco. Louisa Jespersen, a 24-year-old from Denmark, and Maren Juland, a 28-year-old from Norway, were found dead on December the 17th, having been beheaded by Islamic extremists. And that's the short story. The actual truth of the killing is far worse. The two girls were stabbed multiple times and had their throats slit before being decapitated. The killers of the two girls filmed the horrifying act, and one of the group uploaded the video to social media, where it went viral after thousands of people shared it on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networks. Since then, relatives of the victims, including Louisa Jespersen's mother, have had their Facebook pages spammed with photographs of their daughter's severed heads. So far, 19 people have been arrested in relation to these shocking murders. Yes, 19. The four ringleaders who orchestrated the killings and organised the group had pledged their allegiance to the Islamic State just weeks earlier. Now, usually, when attacks like this happen, words such as lone wolf and isolated are used to describe the suspects. But when 19 people have been arrested in connection with a case, I don't think describing the killers as lone wolves is really quite fitting. In fact, the term lone and the word wolves doesn't really work, as lone implies a singular and wolves is plural. However, sadly, that's exactly what a Moroccan police and domestic intelligence spokesman called the murderers. You see, as 19 people were involved in this, I am going to be bold enough to bet that far more knew about it. That at least some of the people involved would have consulted others. Some would have spoken of their twisted desires with friends or relatives. And some would have even boasted or spoken openly of their plans. This case is not a case of a lone wolf. It is not a case of one isolated lunatic. It isn't a case of someone who had sat alone in their bedroom plotting something in darkness, cut off from reality. This is a case of an organised and planned attack carried out by a large number of people who were clearly able to operate freely and recruit with relative ease from the community in which they lived, which paints a rather dark picture of that community and what that community tolerates. But when horrific incidents like this occur, there's always someone to blame. And the press, the media, and the politicians always try to point their fingers at something rather vague, something that is intangible. It's usually a collection of fuzzy yet emotive words, words that sound fitting and stir feelings. The establishment favours words like hate and extremism. These words are carefully chosen to sway the masses. Yet without context, they lack true meaning, because hate and extremism didn't kill those two girls. 19 Muslim men killed those two girls. But it wasn't Islam that sent those girls to their deaths, and it wasn't hate or extremism either. Liberalism sent those girls to their deaths. And let me illustrate this with a short fairy tale. A long time ago, in a green and pleasant land, there was a village, and the folk that lived in that village lived a good and happy life. The village folk looked alike, acted alike, and had a strong sense of community. They had what was known as a high-trust society, a society born from the high IQ people that lived within the village. For the most part, people got on well. They lived and worked in harmony and saw one another as extended family. The village was peaceful and the people who lived there enjoyed good lives. But the village and its people were not alone. The village was surrounded by hills, mountains, and forests, and the landscape was broken up by rivers and lakes. And in those hills and mountains and forests and bodies of water, there were many different creatures, some friendly and some not so friendly. And the youngsters from the village were adventurous. Their curiosity was passed down to them from their forefathers, who had a pioneering nature. Exploration was part of who they were. It was common for the youngsters from the village to go off on trips, to explore the mountains, the hills, and the woods, to swim in the lakes and fish the streams around the village. But somewhere deep in the forest, in the darkest corner, where the trees were overgrown and tangled, and light barely ever hit the forest floor, in that gloomy place there were rumours of creatures. Creatures with sharp teeth and claws. Creatures who stalked those who entered their domain. Creatures who preyed on those foolish enough to make their way to that shadowy place. And the youngsters in the village, they had heard the rumours, but the elders, the school teachers, and those who were held up by the village elders as role models, all scoffed at such talk, and reassured the youngsters that such tales were just nonsense, superstition, and lies. They told the youngsters that those in the village that talked of such creatures in the dark forest were mad, that those speaking of such demons were twisted and bitter and filled with bad thoughts. Many of the youngsters went as far as to mock the few in the village who warned of the dangers of the dark forest and the things that dwelled within the shadows. What's more, the village elders, the teachers, and those held up as role models encouraged this mockery, often joining in and attempting to heap shame on the few villagers who dared to attempt to raise the alarm and warn others of the creatures that made their home in the dark, twisted trees. But those elders and teachers who joined in the mockery, they kept a secret. They all knew of the people who had disappeared there. Brave and adventurous youths with open minds and adventurous spirits who had never come home. But such was the commitment of the elders to the lie that the village was safe and the forest was free of monsters, that they would never admit to anyone, not even themselves, that danger lurked in the dark, twisted trees. And one day, during the long summer season, when the seeds were sown and the harvest time was yet to come, a group of plucky youngsters decided to prove the foolish and superstitious minority wrong. They got together and declared they would travel to the dark woods and camp for a weekend. They would show the village that all of the lands surrounding their homes were safe, and that those who spread superstition were just out of touch with reality. They were stuck in the past and should stop their fear-mongering. At this point, those who dared to speak out began to try and warn the youngsters, began to tell the truth even louder. They told the youngsters stories of the people who had gone missing, of those who had never come home. But the elders, the teachers, and the village role models drowned out their voices with a chorus of laughter. They reassured the youngsters that anyone who hadn't come home had either decided not to return or had maybe had an unfortunate accident. And in fact, such accidents were the fault of those who suffered them, that those who never returned home were doing things they shouldn't have been, and that good young people would never come to such harm. As the youngsters walked toward the forest, they sang songs and smiled, and the village elders waved them off. By this time, those who had tried to warn the youngsters had been thoroughly shouted down. They simply muttered and looked at the floor. Days passed, and soon days turned into weeks. The youngsters who had left full of smiles and singing songs still had not returned. Word spread fast around the village, and rumours were rife that something had happened to them. Rumours that involved the creatures in the dark forest. The village elders were displeased by this and called a town meeting. The longest serving of the village elders stood up and began to speak. He spoke of naivety and youthful foolishness. He spoke of unfortunate accidents and how young people would often eat the wrong berries, which would lead to them making bad decisions. And then he went on to assure the villagers that despite their fears, they were safe, and fear-mongering and rumours were in fact the greatest threat to their children. A lone man then stood up and began to speak. He asked the elder if he was so sure that monsters did not exist, if he was so sure that the young people who had gone into the dark forest had gone missing by accident. Why wouldn't he and his family go into that part of the forest to dispel the myths and show the villagers exactly how safe they really were? At this point, the elder simply motioned to the village magistrate, and the lone man was removed from the meeting. After all, trouble causers and fearmongers weren't tolerated at such meetings, as they were the real threat to village life. and forevermore the tale was destined to repeat itself. That's a very simple story, but I hope it illustrates a powerful point. The Muslims who brutally murdered those 2 girls were obviously to blame for carrying out such horrific acts. They chose to do such things, and that is on them. However, why would 2 girls put themselves in such a situation where such a horrific fate may befall them? Why would 2 young ladies go to such a dangerous place and put themselves in harm's way? The answer is simple. These girls didn't think they were going to a place that was unsafe. They didn't think they were going into the mouth of danger. They had been told by their liberal teachers, by the media, by the press, and by the entire political establishment that they shouldn't fear other cultures, other nations, or people who were different. These 2 girls went looking for adventure, and they never returned home. And part of the problem was naivety. Part of the problem was the fact that these girls had probably dismissed warnings about the dangers. They probably classed those who spoke of dangers as bigots and racists and laughed at their warnings. But who sowed the seeds of that naivety? The whole liberal system, the media, the press, the education system, and the politicians. All those who helped reassure those girls that wandering off on that adventure was safe have blood on their hands. And if the girls' parents encourage such a trip, they too share a degree of blame. These naive girls were sent to their deaths because the liberal establishment would rather see Western youngsters beheaded than tell Western youngsters the truth about the dangers posed by other cultures. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.